All right, class. So we're still on Learning Objective 1.4. Um, I just realized that I did not go over the drawbacks of a correlational research study. So we're going to do that and then move forward in experimental methods. Okay? So one of the significant issues with the correlational study is that correlation does not prove causation. So, although variables may have some form of relationship with each other, this particular type of study does not provide a clear explanation of why. And so correlational studies are sufficient in gaining insight, but it doesn't provide some form of cause. It's also super important to understand that having a correlation coefficient provides substantial information. Again, as we previously noted, a correlation coefficient indicates the strength of a relationship between two variables. And remember, it ranges from +1 to -1. Now, some of the drawbacks, well, let's go over some of the advantages of a correlational study. So, the advantages to having a correlational study is that it allows you to gain information about a topic that you can't necessarily do some form of experiment with because of the ethical reasons. If we know that some form of a substance is going to provide harm to a patient, to a subject, then we can't do a direct study on that. However, if a person is already participating in that unhealthy behavior, we can then conduct a correlational study on the different variables. So that provides some form of insight. Another advantage to a correlational study is that it's less time consuming to conduct. So you're basically collecting information on behaviors that was previously performed or currently being performed, and then you can appear or you can receive some form of summary of how that particular behavior interacts with another said behavior. You'll also find that correlational studies, as noted by researchers, are often less complex. So teams really enjoy that particular advantage. So remember, correlational studies falls up under a predictive hypothesis. Now we're moving to a an experiment. So it's really important to remember that an experimental research method allows us to understand cause and effect between two or more variables or conditions. Remember, an experimental research study is appropriate for a causal hypothesis. Again, a causal hypothesis is a prediction about cause-effect relationship between two or more variables. It's also important to identify the word variable and provide a definition for it. So a variable is any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. So as we know that there are two major types of variables in experimental study. So the independent variable is a factor or condition deliberately manipulated to determine whether it causes changes in another behavior or condition. That is the variable that is actively manipulated. The independent variable can be some form of treatment or some form of intervention. The team will also assess the dependent variable. Is any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. It is measured at the end of the experiment. So, independent variable and dependent variable. With an experimental study, you will find that there's two major groups. The first group is the experimental group. This is the group of people who are exposed to an independent variable or that effective treatment that's deemed to be relevant for the issue of study. You also have a control group. A control group is a group similar to the experimental group. However, they're not given that effective treatment, the treatment that is mainly being studied by the research team. They're present to provide some form of comparison. So, a control group will get a what? A placebo. So they're going to receive some form of sugar pill or some form of intervention that is not thought to be very productive in changing the behavior or the outcome that they want to obtain. However, you will find that the comparison group or the control group may experience what we call the placebo effect. The placebo effect is when the individuals who are part of the comparison group respond to treatment, and they're responding to treatment, which could be in a positive way, because of their expectations. They're in this research, they have a little bit of knowledge about the purpose of the research, and so oftentimes their perception and behavior changes because of it. Their particular interaction with the research. It's really important that when research teams create their studies that they implement a random assignment. In fact, if you want to be a true experiment, you have to have a random assignment, meaning all participants that's within this study have an equal chance of being assigned to each condition. So they may fall within the comparison group, or they may be a part of the experimental group, but they have an equal chance. You do not want to have what we call a selection bias. Assignments to groups that doesn't fall into some form of randomness. So for the most part, computers will create some form of generated list of who's in which group. While the team is conducting their research, they want to make sure that they keep the confounding variables at a minimum. So they're trying to make sure the extraneous variables such as time of day, type of subject, or experimenter bias is out of the equation or out of the research. And that way they receive some true data at the end of the research. I bet you're thinking, well, if this is an experimental form of research, how can you have some form of experimenter bias? Or more specifically, what is that? Well, that's basically when the research team influence the results of the experiment. And it could be done in a number of ways. So, to remove that bias, oftentimes individuals would choose to have a double blind procedure. So, a double blind procedure is when the research team nor the participants are aware of who's in which group. And so that way you keep everybody's hands clean and you're able to receive the data. Now, I know earlier I mentioned placebo, and as you recall, the placebo is more specifically for the control group. And I also mentioned the placebo effect, so make sure that you remember those terms.